The wind, a thin, keening hound, worried the edges of Alara's worn shawl, its bite sharper than the stubble under her bare, chilblained feet. Autumn was bleeding out of the year, leaving the fields of Oakhaven stripped and sere, the color of old parchment. Each gust carried the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the faint, ever-present smokiness that clung to everything in their village, a blend of cook fires and the deeper, more acrid tang from the reeve's slightly grander chimney. Alara bent lower, her eyes, dark and fiercely focused, scanning the clods of earth for any missed ears of wheat. Any stray barley head the main harvest had overlooked. Her fingers, already stiff with cold, worked with a desperate, practiced swiftness. Each grain recovered was a small victory against the gnawing emptiness in her belly, a tiny offering to the dwindling pile in their hut that was supposed to see them, her father, John, and her two younger siblings, Thomas and Agnes, through the coming winter. The sky, a low, bruised purple, promised more rain, or perhaps even an early, unwelcome snow. Already the mornings brought a crust of frost that shattered underfoot, a glittering mockery of beauty when beauty filled no stomachs. Alara straightened, pressing a hand to the small of her back where a dull ache always resided. She was 19, though some days, particularly when Thomas coughed his thin, rattling cough through the night, she felt as old as the gnarled oak that marked the village boundary. Her dark hair, escaping its rough linen tie, whipped across a face too thin, accentuating the pale line of a scar that vanished into her temple, a childhood brand from a hearthside fall. A permanent reminder of hunger's treachery. When she smiled, which was seldom, it was a fleeting, cautious movement of her lips that rarely reached the deep pools of her eyes, eyes that had witnessed more hardship than joy in their short span. She carried her slight, wiry frame with a resilience born of necessity rather than inherent strength, a constant alertness in her posture. A shout, distant and imperious, cut through the wind. Reeve Edmund, no doubt, his voice carrying like a bad omen. Alara's stomach tightened. His presence always meant demands, reminders of dues, of the Lord's insatiable needs that seemed to grow even as their own harvests shrank. She quickly bundled the few pathetic ears of grain into the fold of her skirt, her movements economical, almost furtive. Survival in Oakhaven, in this year of our Lord 1347, was a lesson in small secrecies, a constant, weary game of hiding crumbs from a ravenous authority. Back in their hut, a single, cramped room of wattle and daub with a leaking thatched roof, the air was thick with the familiar smells of stale straw, unwashed bodies, damp earth from the floor, and the thin, peppery smoke that never quite managed to escape the ill-fitting hole in the thatch. It was a smell Alara had known all her life, the perfume of poverty. Agnes, all of 5 years, sat on the dirt floor, listlessly pushing a smooth stone through the dust. Her small face, smudged and pale, lit up briefly when Alara entered. A small, hopeful flower in a barren landscape. Thomas, 3 years Agnes's senior, lay huddled under their single, mended blanket on the straw pallet they all shared. His coughing was worse today, a dry, hacking sound that scraped at Alara's nerves, each spasm a fresh stab of fear in her heart. "Anything," Agnes whispered, her voice a tiny thread, her eyes wide and fixed on the bulge in Alara's skirt. Alara forced a small, tired smile, the kind that rarely reached her own dark, watchful eyes. She opened her skirt, revealing the meager handful of grain. A little. Chick. Enough for a bit more in the pottage. The pottage. A thin, endlessly simmering gruel of whatever could be found, today. Some withered turnips rescued from the frost-bitten edges of their strip, a handful of dried peas, and now, her gleaned grains. It was less a meal and more a daily ritual of staving off the worst of the hunger pangs, a watery illusion of sustenance. John, their father, sat on a low stool by the dying fire, his shoulders slumped, his gaze fixed on the embers as if seeking answers in their fading glow. He had not spoken a word all morning, nor most of the morning before. Since their mother's death in childbirth 2 years past, a part of him had died too, leaving behind a hollow man. Quick to anger or, worse, a profound, unreachable apathy. He offered little help and even less comfort, his grief a heavy, suffocating cloak over their small household. The scent of stale ale sometimes clung to him when he returned from whatever bleak solace he sought with other broken men of the village. Elara bore the weight of it, along with the care of her siblings, the endless toil in the fields, the constant, wearing anxiety that was her shadow. "Father," Elara said softly, her voice carefully neutral, devoid of the accusation that often simmered beneath the surface. The reeve was shouting. Likely about the wood gathering. John grunted, not looking up. His hair, once as dark as Elara's, was now threaded with grey, matted and unkempt. Let him shout. What wood is there to gather? The forest is picked clean by those who dared risk it, and the Lord's men watch it like hawks guarding treasure. Poaching firewood, even fallen branches from the Lord's wood, was a risky business, punishable by a fine they could not pay or a day in the stocks, exposed to the village's scorn and the elements. But the nights were growing colder, and their pitiful pile of sticks would not last another week. The damp chill of the hut seemed to seep into their very bones. Elara sighed internally. Another burden for her to solve. She moved to Thomas, her hand cool on his forehead. Hot. Too hot. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her weariness. His eyes, when they fluttered open, were clouded with fever, the whites tinged with a sickly yellow. Elara, he rasped, his voice weak, barely audible above the relentless cough that followed. Hush now, Tom, she murmured, smoothing his lank hair, her touch as gentle as she could make it with fingers roughened by toil. Rest. I will make you some willow bark tea. Try to sleep. Willow bark, old Magda, the village midwife and herb woman, had said. Good for fevers. Elara clung to these small pieces of folk wisdom, the only medicine available to them, passed down through generations of hardship. But the willow grove was a long walk, and the bark she had was nearly gone. Each dose was a prayer whispered into the smoky air of their suffering. That night, the frost came down hard, a white, silent thief. Elara woke before dawn, the cold of physical pain in her bones, a cramp in her belly that was more than just hunger. She could see her breath misting in the dim light filtering through the cracks in the wattle and daub walls. A deeper chill, however, emanated from outside, a stillness that spoke of nature's cruel indifference. When she unlatched the rough-hewn door, its wooden pegs groaning in protest, and stepped out, her heart sank. The fields, the small garden plots behind the huts where a few hardy herbs and root vegetables struggled, even the stubborn weeds, were all coated in a thick, crystalline layer of white. The few remaining late crops, some kale that had stubbornly resisted the autumn chill, a patch of late turnips John had grudgingly planted under her constant urging, were stiff and brittle under the icy sheath. The air was utterly still, the silence profound. As if the world itself had frozen, holding its breath. This was not just a morning frost, the kind that melted with the first weak rays of sun. This was a killer frost, the harbinger of true winter, arriving weeks too soon. A low moan escaped her lips, a sound swallowed by the vast, cold silence. This meant less food, significantly less. The carefully hoarded turnips, meant to supplement their dwindling grain, would be ruined. Turned to black mush beneath their icy carapaces. The greens, already sparse, would be inedible. Thomas coughed again inside the hut, a racking, painful sound that seemed to tear through the fragile stillness. The frost outside seemed to mirror the icy grip tightening around Elara's own chest. The shadow of winter, already long and menacing, had just grown a good deal darker, its tendrils reaching into their very home. The village, already on edge, teetering on the brink of serious want, would now be pushed closer to the precipice of starvation. And Alara, with 2 small lives depending on her, felt the weight of that precipice pressing down with unbearable force. She looked up at the pale, indifferent sky, a silent, desperate question forming in her heart: how were they supposed to survive this? What saints had they failed to appease? What sins had they committed to deserve such relentless misfortune? The days that followed the great frost were a descent into a sharper, more immediate kind of misery. The blighted crops in the village plots were a stark testament to their vulnerability. Alara rose before the weak sun, her first thought always of Thomas. His fever clung to him stubbornly, his small body radiating a frightening heat despite the encroaching cold of their hut. The willow bark tea, even when she managed to find a few more strips from a distant, half-dead tree, seemed to do little more than wet his cracked lips. Old Magda. When Alara had sought her out again, her hands clutching a small, precious handful of dried beans as a desperate offering, for Magda's skills, though rooted in ancient knowledge, were not given for free, had merely shaken her head. Her ancient eyes cloudy with a wisdom that offered no tangible comfort. The cold sickness clings, child, Magda had rasped, her voice like dry leaves skittering across stone, her hut filled with the pungent, earthy smells of hanging herbs and simmering concoctions. It takes the weak ones first, those whose inner fire burns low. Pray to Saint Roch, the protector against plague and sickness. And keep him warm, if you can. A good fire. A thick broth. These are as potent as any herb when the chill bites deep. Keep him warm. A good fire. Thick broth. Magda might as well have told her to conjure gold from straw. Their firewood dwindled with alarming speed, each stick precious. Broth required meat, a luxury they had not tasted in months. This drove Alara deeper into the Lord's woods, a place of perpetual twilight and creeping fear. She moved like a wraith among the skeletal trees, her senses stretched taut, listening for the snap of a twig that might betray a forest warden, her eyes darting for fallen branches, for anything that might burn. Each armful she managed to drag back, her muscles screaming in protest, her breath tearing at her raw throat, was a triumph hard won, but the risk gnawed at her. She would seen what, the cooper's boy. His ear nearly torn off for taking a rabbit from a snare not even on the Lord's land but close enough to be deemed so. Firewood was a lesser crime, but Reeve Edmund was not known for his leniency. Especially when the Lord's own winter stores needed replenishing. The village itself was a tinderbox of frayed nerves and hushed anxieties. Faces grew gaunter, eyes larger and more haunted in the dimming light of autumn. Children's cries, thin and fretful, seemed more frequent, a constant, miserable chorus. The meager harvest, now further blighted by the frost, cast a pall over every interaction. Neighbors who once shared a word or a bit of kindling now eyed each other with suspicion. Their interactions curt, their glances fleeting. Who had a hidden store? Who was taking more than their share from the common grazing land, now picked almost bare by desperate animals and even more desperate humans? Alara, fiercely protective of her small family's precarious resources, found herself becoming one of those suspicious eyes. She measured out their grain with painstaking care. Her heart clenching each time Thomas refused the thin pottage, his throat too sore to swallow more than a mouthful. Agnes, sensing the tightening unease that permeated their small hut like the ever-present smoke, clung to Alara's skirts, her usual childish chatter subdued into anxious whispers. John, their father, retreated further into his bitter shell. He would sometimes rouse himself to join the other men for a day's forced labor on the Lord's domain, ditching in the frozen ground or mending fences against the biting wind, work that earned them nothing but the right to remain on their pitiful strip of land, but he returned even more silent, his face set in grim lines, his eyes hollow. He ate what Alara put before him without comment, his eyes rarely meeting hers. The unspoken blame for their mother's death, for their current predicament, for his own broken spirit. hung heavy in the smoky air between them. Elara felt it, a constant, dull ache, another burden to carry alongside the fear and the hunger. One bleak afternoon, as Elara was attempting to mend Thomas's only tunic, its thin wool worn to near transparency, the threads almost parting under her calloused fingers. Reeve Edmund's bulky shadow fell across their doorway, blocking what little light penetrated the gloom. Agnes scurried behind Elara like a frightened mouse, her small hand gripping Elara's skirt. "Girl," Edmund boomed, his portly figure filling the small opening, his breath misting in the cold air. His shrewd eyes, small and hard like a pig's, swept the meager interior of the hut. Lingering on the small pile of firewood, the thin blanket covering Thomas, the pathetic array of their worldly goods. "Your father. Where is he skulking?" "At the Lord's ditching, Master Reeve," Elara said, her voice low, her eyes downcast, fixed on the muddy hem of his slightly better quality tunic. Deference was survival, a lesson learned early and painfully. "Humph. See that he presents himself to me at dusk. The Lord's tithe for the autumn harvest is due to be tallied. And this year, there will be no excuses, no whining about poor yields or early frosts. The Lord requires his tenth, blight or no blight." His gaze fell on the pathetic handful of grain Elara had set aside for their evening meal, a few dozen kernels in a cracked wooden bowl. "Every last speck. His lordship's generosity in allowing you to work his land must be repaid." Elara's blood ran cold. Their store, already perilously low after the frost, was barely enough to see them through a month, let alone the long, dark tunnel of winter. The Lord's tenth, calculated on the theoretical yield before the frost, would leave them with almost nothing. It was a demand for phantom grain, a tax on hope itself. "Yes, Master Reeve," she whispered, her mind racing, a frantic calculus of desperation. How could she hide even a small portion, where Edmund was known to have huts searched if he suspected deceit? His men tearing through meager belongings with callous indifference. He grunted, satisfied with her submission, or perhaps just enjoying the fear in her eyes. He turned to leave, his heavy boots squelching in the mud outside, a sound that seemed to mock their poverty. Elara watched him go, a knot of helpless fury tightening in her chest. The system was a relentless beast, devouring what little they had, indifferent to their suffering. Their pleas, their very lives. Later, as dusk painted the bruised sky in shades of gray and blood orange, and the first, hard stars began to prick the darkening canopy, Elara made a decision. With John still out and Agnes finally asleep, her small face peaceful in a way it rarely was when awake, Elara took half of their remaining grain, a pitifully small amount, barely enough to fill 2 cupped hands. With trembling fingers, she carefully loosened a section of the wattle and daub wall. Behind their shared pallet, a place where the shadows were deepest and the damp from the earth floor seemed to discourage rats. She poured the grain into a small, mended sack her mother had once used for herbs and tucked it into the cavity, replacing the daub as best she could, smoothing it over with dirt and hoping it would pass unnoticed. It was not much, a mere handful of life, but it might mean the difference between hunger and starvation for Agnes and Thomas in the deepest part of winter, when the snows lay thick and the world outside was a frozen, barren wasteland. When John returned, caked in mud and shivering with exhaustion, his face etched with a deeper weariness than usual, Elara told him of the Reeve summons. He merely nodded. His face impassive, his eyes empty. The fight, if there had ever been any left in him, seemed to have gone out of him entirely. He huddled by the fire, coughing, his silence a heavy, accusatory presence. That evening, as the Reeve and 2 of his men, their torches casting grotesque, dancing shadows, went from hut to hut, their voices loud and demanding, their laughter coarse, Elara sat with Thomas, wiping his fevered brow with a damp rag. She could hear the arguments, the occasional cry of despair from neighboring huts as meager stores were measured and carted away. When Edmund reached their door, John stood silently, a broken effigy, as their grain was measured and taken. Elara held her breath, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. When one of Edmund's men idly poked at the wall near her hidden cache with the butt of his staff. But he moved on, uninterested, perhaps deeming their poverty too complete for further scrutiny. They were left with less than half of what they had, and winter had not even truly begun. The air in the hut felt colder, the shadows deeper. Elara looked at Thomas, his breathing shallow, his small face etched with pain. She looked at Agnes, asleep now, her thumb in her mouth, her dreams hopefully free of gnawing hunger and the Reeves' menacing bulk. She looked at her father, already slumped by the cold hearth, lost in whatever bleak landscape his mind inhabited. Despair was a cold, creeping thing, a tangible presence in the hut, but Elara fought it back with a ferocity born of love and desperation. She had to. For them. She would go deeper into the woods tomorrow. Risk more. She would find something. She had to. The thought of the hidden grain was a tiny, secret warmth within her, a fragile shield against the encroaching darkness. A few days later, as if summoned by their deepening misery, old Magda came to their hut. It was unusual for her to make calls unbidden unless the sickness was dire or death was near, and Elara's heart lurched with a fresh wave of fear. Had Thomas worsened so much that word had reached her through the village's network of whispers and worried glances? Magda, her face a network of ancient wrinkles that seemed to hold the history of Oakhaven's sorrows, her eyes sharp and knowing beneath a hood of dark, coarse wool, merely nodded at Elara and went straight to Thomas's side. She felt his forehead, listened to his ragged breathing, her lips pursed in a silent, grim assessment. "The fever holds him tight," she pronounced at last, her voice surprisingly strong for one so frail-looking, a reedy sound that cut through the hut's oppressive quiet. She rummaged in the worn leather pouch that hung at her belt, a pouch that always smelled of damp earth, dried herbs, and mystery. She produced a small, dried root, gnarled and dark. "This is comfrey. Grind it fine, child. Mix it with a little pig fat if you have any, though I doubt that, or even just water from the stream. Make a poultice and bind it to his chest. It may draw out some of the fire, if God wills it and the humors are not too corrupted." Pig fat. Elara almost laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. As if they had such a luxury. Their last piglet had gone to the Reeve months ago, part of an earlier due. Elara nodded numbly, accepting the root with a murmured thanks. "Thank you, Magda. We have no fat. Water will serve, then, though less potent." Magda's gaze, keen and unsettlingly perceptive, roamed the small hut, taking in the meager supplies, the damp walls where mildew was beginning to creep, the listless form of John by the hearth. "There is talk in the village," she said, her gaze fixing Elara with an intensity that made her flinch. "Of sickness spreading. Young Will, the thatcher's son, is down with it too, coughing his lungs out. And Martha, from the mill, her skin burns like a coal." Elara's fear intensified, coiling in her stomach. A village-wide sickness, on top of the hunger, the coming cold. It would be a scythe cutting through Oakhaven, sparing few. "The priest, Father Michael, says it is God's displeasure," Magda continued, a hint of something unreadable in her tone, skepticism, or just the weary resignation of one who had seen too much suffering to attribute it all to divine wrath, for our sins. "He calls for more prayer, more penance." "And what do you say, Magda?" Elara asked, a boldness she did not feel infusing her voice. She needed something more than prayers, more than blame. Magda shrugged, a small, bird-like movement of her thin shoulders. I say the damp and the bad air from the fun when the wind blows from the west settle in the lungs. And empty bellies make for weak spirits to fight off any ailment. She looked around the hut again, her eyes lingering on the tightly shut wooden shutter that covered their only window opening. You keep this place too closed up, child. Sickness festers in stale air, like mold on damp bread. The bad humors collect, with nowhere to go. She pointed a gnarled finger towards the shutter. Open it sometimes. Even if it is cold. Let the wind, even a harsh wind, carry the bad humors away. Fresh air is a physic the Lord provides for free, though few have the sense to use it. Elara stared at her. This was contrary to everything she knew, everything her mother had taught her. Cold and damp were the enemy. Drafts brought illness, chills that settled deep in the bones and lungs. To deliberately invite the biting November air into their already freezing hut seemed madness. But the cold, Magda, Elara stammered. Thomas. He shivers so. A quick airing, child, not a gale, Magda said, a touch of impatience in her voice. Stir the air. The sickness itself breeds in closeness, in the breath of the afflicted fouling the air for others. She patted Elara's arm, her touch surprisingly firm. Try it. What have you to lose that you are not already losing? With that, she turned and was gone, a fleeting shadow disappearing into the grey afternoon. Elara was left staring at the shutter, Magda's words echoing in her mind. It went against all ingrained wisdom, yet, there was a strange sort of sense to it, a sense that resonated with her own feeling of being trapped, suffocated by their circumstances. That afternoon, while her father was out on another forced labor detail, hauling stones for the Lord's new wall in the biting wind, Elara, after a long moment of hesitation, unlatched the small wooden shutter. A blast of cold, damp air immediately filled the hut, carrying the scent of wet earth, rotting leaves, and a cleaner, sharper tang than the usual smoky fog. Agnes shivered and complained, burrowing deeper into the straw. Elara herself flinched from the chill. But, remembering Magda's confident assertion, and with a strange little flicker of what felt like defiance against the stifling misery, she left it open for a short while, perhaps the time it took to say 10 aves. The raw November air circulated, ruffling Thomas's hair, making the single tallow dip gutter wildly. Then, her courage failing slightly, she closed it again against the deepening chill of the late afternoon. It was a small thing, perhaps a foolish thing, a desperate act based on the words of an old woman whose wisdom was as much feared as respected. But in a world where she had so little control, where every day was a battle against forces far beyond her comprehension or power, it felt like an action, a tiny push against the overwhelming tide of their misfortune. She noticed, as she swept the dirt floor later with a worn birch broom, that the air in the hut felt marginally less heavy, the ever-present odor of sickness and stale straw slightly diminished. Or perhaps, she thought with a familiar stab of cynicism, it was just her imagination. A desperate mind clinging to any sliver of hope, however irrational. The comfort poultice, mixed with a little stream water and bound to Thomas's chest with a strip of ragged linen, did nothing to ease his fever. If anything, he seemed weaker as the days passed. His skin more translucent, his small hand unnervingly cold when Elara held it, even as his forehead burned. His coughs were shallower, but more frequent, as if his lungs lacked the strength for a proper expectoration. The news of a traveling peddler reached Oakhaven a week later, a rare ripple of excitement in their stagnant pool of misery. Peddlers meant trinkets, ribbons, perhaps a bit of news from the outside world, a fleeting distraction from the daily grind of hunger and fear. Elara, however, saw a different kind of opportunity, a desperate, flickering hope. Peddlers sometimes carried spices, or rare herbs, things old Magda did not possess. Things from faraway lands with magical-sounding names. Perhaps, just perhaps, this one might have something, anything, that could help Thomas, something more potent than local willow bark or comfrey root. She took the only thing of true sentimental value she possessed, a small, intricately carved wooden bird, one of the last things her mother had held, a token from her own girlhood. Passed down from her grandmother. Its smooth, worn wood felt warm in her hand, a tangible link to a time before the constant ache of loss. Its loss would be a sharp pain, a severing of another thread to her mother, but Thomas's life, his fragile, flickering life, was worth more than any memory, however precious. The peddler, a wiry man named Silas with a shrewd, weather-beaten face and a pack laden with an astonishing variety of goods, bright ribbons that mocked their drab existence, tin pots, cheap knives with bone handles, and, most importantly to Alara, a section devoted to dubious-looking medicines and charms, had set up his small stall near the church, the most public space in Oakhaven. A small crowd of villagers had gathered, their faces hungry for novelty, for a momentary escape. Children pointed at the trinkets, their mothers quickly pulling them away, their own eyes lingering on a length of colored wool or a shiny buckle they could never afford. Alara approached him timidly, the wooden bird clutched in her sweaty palm, its familiar contours a small comfort. "Master Peddler," she began, her voice barely a whisper, easily lost in the chatter of the small crowd and the ever-present wind. She had to try again, louder this time, pushing through a knot of curious children. "Master Peddler." "Sir." Silas, his eyes constantly scanning for potential customers, turned to her, his gaze assessing her worn clothes, her thin face, in an instant. Girl, what is it you desire? A ribbon for your hair, a new bodkin, perhaps." His voice was oily, persuasive. "No, sir," Alara said, her throat tight. "My brother. He is gravely ill with a fever. A terrible fever that will not break. Do you have a cure, something strong, from your travels?" The peddler's eyes flickered with a new interest, the kind that calculated profit from desperation. He stroked his stubbled chin. "A fever, you say, a stubborn one, I have just the thing. But such potent remedies. They do not come cheap, little miss." He eyed the crudely carved bird she extended, her hand trembling. He picked it up, turned it over in his calloused fingers, his expression unreadable. "A pretty thing," he conceded after a moment. "A child's toy, hardly worth a powerful cordial, say, my special feverfew concoction, imported all the way from the great apothecaries of Norwich. That, my dear, costs a silver penny." "A silver penny." Alara felt tears prick her eyes but blinked them back fiercely. A silver penny was a fortune, an impossible sum. They had not seen silver in their hut for over a year. "I have nothing else," she said, her voice thick with despair, the hope that had briefly flared within her guttering like a cheap candle. "This bird. It was my mother's. It is all I have of her." She had not meant to say that, to reveal its value to her, but the words tumbled out. The peddler, perhaps seeing the raw desperation in her eyes, or perhaps simply wanting to make a sale, however small, and be rid of her, rummaged in a stained leather pouch at his belt. He produced a small twist of dark, pungent leaves, tied with a piece of string. "Dragon's tongue from the Holy Land," he announced grandly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, though Alara suspected its origins were far more mundane. Perhaps from a hedgerow no further than the next county. Brought back by a returning crusader, blessed by a hermit. Very powerful against stubborn fevers. It purges the evil humors that cause the affliction, drives them out through sweat and flux. He held it out. For this bird. And perhaps a promise of a fresh egg when your hens next lay. A small token of gratitude for such a potent medicine. Their only hen, a scrawny, bad-tempered creature, had stopped laying weeks ago, another casualty of the dwindling food and the encroaching cold. But Alara nodded eagerly, clutching at this last, flimsy straw. Yes, yes. An egg. I promise, when she lays. He pocketed the bird with a swift movement. Boil these leaves in water, girl. Let him drink the infusion while it is warm. And pray. Even the strongest medicine needs the Lord's blessing. Alara hurried back to the hut, the peddler's dragon's tongue clutched tight in her hand. It smelled acrid and unfamiliar, a scent that made her nostrils twitch. She boiled it as instructed, using precious twigs from their dwindling woodpile. The dark liquid filled the hut with a strange, bitter scent that made Agnes wrinkle her nose. Thomas, his eyes barely open, his lips parched and cracked, managed to swallow a few sips before turning his head away with a low moan, his small body tensing. That night was the worst yet. Thomas thrashed and cried out in his delirium, his small body burning as if consumed by an inner fire. The dragon's tongue seemed only to have aggravated his distress, bringing on fits of retching that left him weaker than before. Alara, her heart a cold stone of terror and self-recrimination, sat by him, wiping his face with a damp rag, murmuring prayers she barely believed in anymore, her mother's wooden bird a phantom. Weight in her memory. John slept through it all, or pretended to, his back to them, a wall of indifference. By morning, Thomas was terrifyingly still. His breathing was so shallow, so faint, that Alara had to lean close, her ear almost touching his lips, to feel its faint, fluttering warmth on her cheek. His skin was cold and clammy, despite the embers she had desperately tried to keep alive in the hearth. Despair, absolute and crushing, threatened to engulf her. She had failed. Her mother's bird, traded for a useless, perhaps even harmful, concoction from a charlatan. The weight of her choices, her helplessness, was a physical agony that stole her breath. She thought of Magda's words she had almost dismissed, let the wind carry the bad humors away. It was a fool's hope, an old woman's fancy. But what else was left, with a surge of desperate, irrational energy, fueled by grief and a terror that bordered on madness, she stumbled to the window shutter and threw it open wide, heedless of the biting November wind that immediately swept into the hut, stirring the straw, making the embers in the hearth glow faintly before threatening to extinguish them. She did not care about the cold. She did not care about anything but the fragile, nearly extinguished thread of Thomas's life. If he was to die, let him at least breathe air that was not thick with the smell of their shared misery and his own sickness. She sat by him for hours, the raw wind on her face, chilling her to the bone, her gaze fixed on his still, small form. Agnes, sensing the terrible gravity of the moment, huddled silently beside her, her small hand creeping into Alara's, seeking a comfort Alara could not give. The hut felt like a tomb, cold and silent save for the keening of the wind. It was near midday, the light outside a pale, watery gray, when Thomas stirred. His eyelids fluttered, a faint movement in the stillness of his face. He coughed. A weak, shallow sound, but then he blinked, his gaze, for the first time in days, seeming to focus, clearer than it had been. Alara, he whispered, his voice a mere thread of sound, but it was his voice. His forehead, when she frantically touched it, was still warm, but the raging fire that had consumed him seemed to have receded, leaving behind a more natural heat. A sob escaped Alara, a raw, animal sound of disbelief and overwhelming relief that tore from her throat. She clutched his hand, tears streaming down her face, heedless of the cold, of Agnes's wondering stare, of anything but the miracle of that faint, questioning voice. He was weak, terribly weak, his small body almost ethereal in its fragility, but he was alive. The crisis, for now, by some mercy she could not comprehend, seemed to have passed. Whether it was the dubious dragon's tongue finally working its purging magic, or Magda's unconventional advice about the air, or simply the mysterious ebb and flow of sickness that sometimes spared the very young. Elara did not know. She did not care. He was alive. The small, hidden cache of grain behind the wall, once a desperate secret, suddenly felt like a king's ransom. It would help see them through a little longer, provide a slightly thicker pottage for a recovering boy. The relief, however, fragile as it was, proved to be tragically short-lived. News, or rather, a decree from the unseen lord of the manor, arrived with Reeve Edmund a few days later. He swaggered into the center of the village, his face set in lines of grim importance, his voice booming across the assembled fearful peasants. The Lord, Edmund announced, concerned by the reports of a poor harvest across his lands, and perhaps, Elara thought bitterly, by whispers of unrest in other more distant manors where starvation had already taken hold, had ordered an additional levy, a winter tax, Edmund called it, of grain and whatever poultry or pigs remained, to ensure his own larders and those of his retinue were full and his winter feasts unmarred by scarcity. The villagers received the news with a mixture of stunned, horrified silence and furious, quickly suppressed murmurs that rippled through the crowd like a disturbed anthill. It was beyond cruel. It was a death sentence for many. They had already given their tithe, calculated on a harvest that had never fully materialized. This new demand, coming now as winter began to bite in earnest, would strip them bare, leaving them with nothing but prayers and frozen earth. Edmund, impervious to their despair, his eyes scanning their faces for any sign of open defiance, announced that the collection would begin in 3 days. "And I expect full compliance," he stated, his gaze sweeping over their sullen, downtrodden faces. "His lordship does not tolerate shirkers or thieves. Any attempt to hide what is rightfully his will be met with the severest punishment." Elara felt a cold dread, colder than any winter wind, clutch at her heart. Her hidden grain, her precious, hoarded secret, was now their only hope of surviving even the early part of winter with Thomas still so frail. But if Edmund, in his zeal to please the Lord, ordered thorough searches, the next 2 days were filled with a frantic, desperate tension that settled over Oakhaven like a shroud. Elara considered moving the grain again, but to where? Every hut would be suspect. The woods were too risky, the ground too damp, and any cache she made would likely be found by other desperate foragers or the Lord's men. She felt trapped, her earlier small victory over Thomas's illness now overshadowed by this new, more immediate threat. John, for once, seemed shaken from his apathy. His face gray with a worry that mirrored her own, though he offered no solutions, only muttered curses against the Lord and the Reeve under his breath, curses that were both futile and dangerous. Thomas was slowly, painstakingly regaining a little strength. He could sip broth now, a thin concoction Elara made from boiled bones begged from the butcher after the last livestock slaughter for the Lord's table. His fever had not returned with its former intensity, though he remained weak and listless. Elara clung to this small improvement, a drowning sailor clinging to a piece of driftwood, but the Reeves' impending visit cast a long, dark shadow over it. On the 3rd day, a gray, bitter morning with the threat of snow heavy in the air, Edmund arrived. He was flanked by 2 thuggish-looking men Elara did not recognize, likely brought in from another of the lords' manors to enforce the collection and discourage any thought of resistance. They moved through the village with brutal efficiency, their sacks filling with the pitiful remnants of Oakhaven's harvest, their ears deaf to the cries and pleas that followed in their wake. When they reached Elara's hut, John stood trembling by the door, his eyes darting nervously from the Reeve to his men, his hands twisting the ragged edge of his tunic. Edmund, his face a mask of officious authority, pushed past him without a word, his men fanning out inside the small, dim space. "Well, John," Edmund said, his voice laced with a sneer that made Elara's skin crawl. "Let us see what pathetic store you have managed to squirrel away from your betters this time." His men began to search, roughly tossing aside their meager belongings, a wooden bowl, a chipped pottery jug, the mended blanket from the pallet, their movements contemptuous. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might break free. She watched, frozen, as one of the men, a burly fellow with a cruel mouth, approached the wall where the grain was hidden. He prodded it with the toe of his heavy, mud-caked boot. "Loose here, Master Reeve," he grunted, a knowing look on his face. "Feels hollow." Edmund's eyes narrowed, a glint of malicious triumph in them. "Oh, hiding things from your lord, are we, John, after all my warnings, you peasants never learn." Before John could stammer a denial, before the fear could completely paralyze her, Ilara stepped forward. She did not know where the words came from, only that a sudden, cold fury, a terrifying clarity, had overridden her fear. Thomas was still so weak, his life a fragile flame. Agnes was watching from the darkest corner of the hut, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored Ilara's own childhood nightmares. They could not lose this grain. It was all that stood between them and utter starvation. "There is nothing there, Master Reeve," Ilara said, her voice surprisingly steady, though her insides churned like a stormy sea. "Nothing but damp earth and hungry rats, like the rest of this cursed village you helped to bleed dry." Edmund turned, his thick neck creaking, genuinely surprised by her audacity. A girl, a mere slip of a peasant girl, daring to address him, let alone with such insolence. "And who are you to speak, wench?" he snarled, his face beginning to flush. "I am Ilara," she said, her chin lifting fractionally as she met his gaze directly. The scar on her temple throbbed faintly, a familiar pulse of old pain and new defiance. "Daughter of this man. John of Oakhaven. Sister to that sick child you would see starve to death before the snows melt." She gestured towards Thomas, who was watching, pale and frightened. From the pallet. "You have taken our tithe, calculated on a harvest that never was. You have taken the best of our fields, the strength of our men, for the Lord's pleasure and your own filling belly. Now you come for the crumbs, the very dust that might keep us alive through the winter. Is your Lord so poor, Master Reeve, that he must steal the last mouthful from a child's lips? Is his power so great that it rests upon the bones of starving peasants?" A shocked, breathless silence fell in the small hut. John stared at her, aghast, his mouth agape. The Reeves men, for a moment, looked uncertain, their brutishness faltering in the face of such raw, unexpected courage. Even Edmund seemed momentarily taken aback, his bluster deflating. His face, usually ruddy with food and authority, paled slightly, then flushed a dark, angry purple that seemed to swell his features. "Insolent slut," he finally roared, his voice cracking with fury. "You dare question the Lord's due, you dare accuse me of theft." He took a threatening step towards her, his hand raised, clenched into a fist, as if to strike her down. John, to Ilara's utter astonishment, and perhaps his own, suddenly moved. He stumbled in front of her, his thin, work-worn body surprisingly solid, shielding her from the Reeves' impending blow. "Leave her be, Edmund," he croaked, his voice rough with disuse and a flicker of some long-buried, almost forgotten fire. "She is but a girl, overwrought with worry for her brother. She speaks. She speaks what many feel but dare not say aloud. Take what you will find. But leave the girl. Harm her, and you answer to more than just me." The last was a hollow threat. For John had no power, no standing, but the unexpectedness of it, the sheer unlikelihood of him intervening, gave it a strange weight. Edmund, his hand still raised, hesitated. His eyes, burning with humiliated rage, flickered from Ilara's defiant, pale face to John's unexpected protectiveness, then to the section of wall the man had indicated. To strike a man, even a broken, pathetic one like John, in front of his own men after such a public challenge from a mere girl, might look weak, or worse, it might incite something uglier in the watching, silent villagers who had begun to gather at a distance, drawn by the commotion, their faces grim and unreadable in the grey light. His authority, usually so absolute in this small, cowed village, felt, for a fleeting moment, surprisingly fragile. He lowered his hand slowly, his breath hissing through his teeth. "You will regret this. Both of you," he hissed, his voice venomous, promising future retribution. "I will have that wall torn down. And if I find so much as a single hidden grain more than what is declared, you will both taste the Lord's justice in the stocks for a weak, sick child or no." He spat on the dirt floor, a gesture of profound contempt. "Search it," he commanded his men. But his usual boisterous confidence seemed slightly diminished, his victory tainted. The men, with less enthusiasm now, perhaps sensing the shift in the atmosphere, or merely wanting to be done with this unpleasant confrontation, pulled at the wattle and daub. The hidden sack was revealed. It was, as Alara knew, a pitifully small amount, barely a few days' sustenance for one person, let alone 3. Edmund kicked at it with the toe of his boot, scattering a few precious grains onto the filthy floor. "Hardly worth the effort of hiding, is it, you thieving curs?" he sneered, though a flicker of something, disappointment, a grudging respect for their pathetic cunning, crossed his face. He had perhaps expected a larger hoard. A more satisfying discovery of deceit. "Take it," he ordered his men, his voice flat. "And take their scrawny chicken too. As a lesson in honesty and a reminder of who holds the power here." Their last hen, a mottled creature that had only just started laying again after a long, barren spell, was grabbed from its roost in the corner, squawking in indignant protest, its struggles futile against the man's rough grip. Alara watched it go, a fresh wave of despair washing over her, but beneath it, a strange, new feeling was taking root, the cold, hard bedrock of having spoken, of having stood, however briefly, however futilely, against the crushing weight of injustice. Edmund gave them one last, malevolent glare, his eyes promising future miseries. "You will be watched, John. And you, girl. Every move, every whisper." He turned and stalked out of the hut, his men following with their meager spoils, leaving behind a silence that was heavier, more charged, than before. The hut felt colder, emptier than ever. John slumped back onto his stool, his brief defiance extinguished, leaving him looking older, more broken than Alara had ever seen him. Agnes, who had hidden her face in Alara's skirt during the worst of it, began to cry softly, a desolate, hopeless sound. Alara went to Thomas. He was looking at her, his eyes, though still shadowed with illness, surprisingly bright, filled with an emotion she could not quite name, awe, perhaps, or a fierce, childish pride. He reached out a thin hand, his fingers surprisingly strong as they clutched hers. "You were brave, Alara," he whispered, his voice still weak but clear. "So brave." Brave, or foolish, Alara did not know. She only knew that something inside her had shifted, cracked open. The fear was still there, a cold, familiar companion, as much a part of her as her own bones. But it was no longer absolute. It now shared space with a tiny, ember-like resolve, a nascent strength she had not known she possessed. The winter that followed was the harshest in living memory, a relentless siege of biting winds, deep snows, and gnawing hunger. Reeve Edmund, true to his word, made their lives even more miserable. John was forced into extra labor. Mending the Lord's fences in the biting cold with inadequate clothing, work that left him coughing raggedly through the nights and his joints swollen with pain. Alara was publicly berated by the priest, Father Michael, after Sunday Mass. Her courageous words twisted into a display of female insolence, a defiance of God's ordained order and the Lord's rightful authority. The priest's voice, usually sonorous and comforting to some, became a lash, singling her out for her prideful tongue and warning other women against such unseemly behavior. Whispers followed her through the village, some fearful, some tinged with a grudging, quickly hidden admiration, many simply indifferent, too lost in their own suffering to spare much thought for the troubles of one family. Their hidden grain was gone, of course, and the loss of the chicken was a bitter blow, depriving them of the occasional precious egg. They survived on what little Alara could forage when the snows briefly receded, frozen berries that tasted like ice and disappointment, tough roots she had to dig from the iron-hard ground with her bare, cracked hands, and sometimes, shamefully, strips of tree bark boiled into a tasteless, desperate soup. Thomas, miraculously, clung to life. His recovery was agonizingly slow, punctuated by relapses of fever and weakness that sent fresh waves of terror through Alara, but he did not succumb. Alara nursed him with a fierce, unyielding tenderness. Her own hunger a constant, dull ache she learned to ignore, a familiar emptiness in her belly. She would often give him her own tiny share of their pottage, a thin, watery brew that tasted mostly of desperation and the smoky residue of their failing fire. She found that her brief act of defiance in the face of Reeve Edmund had changed her in ways she was only slowly beginning to understand. The fear was still there. Yes, a sensible companion in such a world where a wrong word or a stolen glance could bring ruin, but the crushing fatalism that had once threatened to engulf her, the sense that her life was merely a predetermined path of suffering, had receded slightly. She had spoken truth to power. And though the heavens had not opened and the system had not crumbled, she had not broken. There was a stark, bitter kind of freedom in that knowledge, a discovery of an inner core she had not known existed. She became even more observant, her mind working constantly, piecing together small fragments of understanding. She remembered old Magda's words about fresh air with a new clarity. Though their hut was freezing, and John often grumbled about the drafts, she made a point of opening the small wooden shutter for a short while each day, when the wind was not too vicious. She noticed that when she did, Thomas's breathing seemed a fraction easier, the oppressive smell of sickness that clung to their small space less pronounced. It was a small, uncertain observation, one she kept to herself, wary of ridicule or further condemnation. But it was hers, a piece of knowledge gleaned not from superstition or priestly pronouncements, but from her own cautious perception. John, surprisingly, seemed to view her with a new, grudging respect. The wall of his apathy did not crumble entirely, but there were cracks. Occasionally, he would share a piece of information gleaned from the other men at their forced labor, a rumor about the Lord's intentions. A warning about a particularly harsh patch of weather approaching. He still offered little comfort, his words few and often gruff, but the outright neglect lessened. He saw her, truly saw her, Alara thought, perhaps for the first time since her mother died, not as a mere replacement for his lost wife in terms of domestic drudgery, but as someone who had stood when he had faltered, someone who bore their shared burden with a strength he no longer possessed. He even, once or twice, managed to bring back an extra piece of firewood, found on the way from the fields, leaving it by the hearth without a word. As the winter slowly, grudgingly began to release its iron grip, as the days lengthened almost imperceptibly and the first, tentative signs of spring appeared, a pale, brave primrose blooming in a sheltered spot in the woods. The distant, hopeful call of a returning bird, the snowmelt swelling the sluggish stream into a muddy torrent, Oakhaven was a village scarred and diminished. Several of the old and the very young had not survived the hungry months, their passing marked by hurried, shallow graves in the frozen churchyard. But for those who remained, like Alara and her small, battered family, there was a weary resilience, the stubborn, almost defiant refusal of life to be entirely extinguished. Alara stood at the edge of their strip of land, now a patch of thawing mud, pocked with remnant snow, waiting for the distant promise of the plow. The air was still cold, sharp with the lingering breath of winter, but it carried a new scent, the faint, earthy promise of damp earth turning, of new growth hidden beneath the surface. Thomas, still thin and pale but walking now, his cough less frequent, leaned against her, his small hand tucked securely in hers. Agnes, a little wilder, a little hungrier, but undeniably alive, chased a new, bright yellow butterfly with a hazel stick, her laughter, though still thin, a fragile, precious sound in the quiet morning. The future was a vast, uncertain expanse, likely filled with more hardship, more hunger, more demands from the reeve and the unseen, uncaring Lord. Nothing fundamental had changed in their world. The wheel of seasons would turn, bringing its familiar burdens and fleeting joys. But Alara had changed. The scar on her temple was a mark of an old pain, a physical reminder of past vulnerability. But inside, a new mark had been made, a line drawn not by a fall, but by a choice, by words spoken in the face of fear. She had found her voice in the heart of despair. And though it was a small, often unheard voice in a brutal, indifferent world, it was hers. She straightened her shoulders, feeling the weak spring sun on her face. A hesitant warmth that promised little but hinted at possibilities. The fight was far from over. It would likely never be over. But she would meet it. Not with the blind hope of a child, but with the clear-eyed, scarred resilience of one who had stared into the abyss and had not blinked.